Battleship! Battleship! Battleship, Milton Bradley's great game of strategy. It's loaded with action and suspense. Play it anytime, anywhere.
B4. Hit. J1. Ha! You missed. J10. Oh, you struck my battleship.
Battleship, a game of from
This video is sponsored by the people at Wargaming, in their free-to-play game World of Warships, where you can command a massive naval fleet featuring tons of iconic warships. This game is incredibly detailed and realistic. You really feel like you're living the battle. I mean, even the weather affects gameplay. And if you aren't paying attention, you can run aground like an idiot. Every week they have new missions and events and are constantly updating the game, so it's always something different when you log on, and always keeps you entertained. New players can use the code PLAYWARSHIPS2018 to get some awesome in-game content to boost your gameplay from the start, including 250 doubloons, 1,000,000 credits, 3 days of premium, a premium ship, the Campbelltown, and a port slot. And as I was playing the game, I found myself wanting to look more and more into the history of the ships presented, and immediately found myself drawn to the story of the Bismarck, or as I like to call it, the Germans' big ooh. After the Treaty of Versailles in 1918, Germany's armed forces were stripped to a bare minimum, and a lot is talked about how the Army and Air Force were built back up very quickly. But the same is also true of the Kriegsmarine, or German Navy. Being left with few ships in the interwar period, the Germans hurriedly built many battleships that would later take part in the upcoming war in the Atlantic. The crown jewel of these ships, that was first laid in 1936 and completed in 1941, was the gigantic Battleship Bismarck, commanded by Captain Otto Ernst Linderman. The battleship at the time of its creation was one of the largest and most advanced of the time, boasting ridiculous speeds, thick armor, and a litany of guns, including 8 15-inch guns housed in 4 turrets. Very understandably, the launch of this ship made the British very nervous, as on paper it looked like it had the potential to be an unstoppable beast in the Atlantic. As a result, the British tried to keep eyes on it from the day it launched. Its first actual combat mission began on the evening of May 19, 1941, where when leaving port with its escort ship Prince Eugen, it is immediately photographed by a British plane with the information relayed back to the Royal Navy.
Oh, off to a good start already.
Now, although the Bismarck was a battleship killer, this was not its mission on its maiden voyage. Much more of a threat to Germany than British battleships was British merchant shipping, which is what had kept Britain in the war so far. The Germans figured that if Bismarck could head north, through the Denmark Strait, around England near Iceland, and into the Atlantic undetected, it could wreak havoc on British ships bringing supplies to Great Britain. However, this begins to go awry almost immediately. As mentioned before, Bismarck was spotted as it left port at the beginning of its mission. This caused several British ships, including the HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, and the HMS Prince of Wales, to steam towards the strait to intercept the Bismarck. It's also worth mentioning that Linderman did not fully fill his fuel tanks before departure, and a lot of people point to this as a big mistake. It's actually not that dumb, as there were several German oil tankers in the North Atlantic where he planned to refuel, and the advantage of leaving with full tanks was negligible compared to the advantage of leaving sooner in hopes of not being spotted, although that obviously didn't work out. On May 24th, after sailing north and around Iceland, German lookouts spotted the Hood and Prince of Wales under the command of Vice Admiral Holland. Once within range, the Hood began firing upon the Prince Eugen, mistaking it for the Bismarck, while Prince of Wales fired correctly at Bismarck. Prince Eugen returned fire immediately, with the Bismarck beginning to do so a few minutes later. Prince Eugen was ordered to target the Prince of Wales to keep both opponents under fire, as the Bismarck targeted the Hood. However, it is at this point that the Bismarck ran into another problem. The Germans had equipped the Bismarck with advanced radar systems to aid in the range finding for her main guns. The radar system itself was located right next to one of the gun turrets. In one of the first salvos fired at the Hood, the concussion from the guns damaged the relay of these rangefinders, so from this point on, the gunners could not rely on them for sighting. After firing several salvos, one of Bismarck's shells managed to land through the Hood's rear deck and detonate her magazine, sinking it in about 2 minutes, taking all but 3 of her 1,419-man crew with her. After this, both German ships continued to fire on the Prince of Wales, which was heavily damaged, losing her bridge in the fight along with her officers. This was not before the Prince of Wales struck a hit on the Bismarck, entering towards the bow near the deck line and exiting on the other side near the waterline. The Prince of Wales retreated to safety, but Linderman realized the shell had punctured one of the oil tanks, and Bismarck was now leaking oil into the ocean. Now, this isn't a huge problem for most ships, but remember, the Bismarck is trying to move stealthily, and it now has a giant oil slick trailing behind it, giving away its position to any potential aircraft above. After the battle, Bismarck reported that it had sunk one ship, most most likely the hood, and heavily damaged another. Linderman also reported the damage to the Bismarck and his intentions to head for ports in France to make repairs, and to detach Prince Eugen to keep the mission going. Now, after the sinking of the hood, the Royal Navy doubled its efforts to take down the Bismarck. However, at this point, its position had been lost, and the British ships giving chase actually began to move in the wrong direction, thinking it was heading north. When all seemed lost, though, the Bismarck's commander decided to radio Berlin in a somewhat incoherent ramble about their dire situation, in a message that was picked up by British ships and was able to be used to find the Bismarck's position. Shortly after this, the Bismarck's oil slick was spotted by a British seaplane, and the chase was back on. However, British ships in the Atlantic were too far away to be able to catch it in time, and ships from the Mediterranean were ordered out and north to intercept the ship before it could get to France. This group, called Force H, contained the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, carrying a number of obsolete Swordfish torpedo planes. Knowing he could not catch up to the Bismarck with his ships in time, Admiral James Somerville decided to launch his planes in an attempt to stall the Bismarck so that the battleships could catch up. Now, this attack is a literal David and Goliath scenario. The Bismarck had many anti-aircraft guns on it, and the Swordfish were very slow, open-top biplanes. Despite this, though, no Swordfish were taken out in the battle, and one of their torpedoes managed to actually damage the Bismarck's rudder, making it dead in the water. And the whole battle is a meme in itself. If you want to know more about how none of the Swordfish were taken out, check out Military History Visualized video on the battle.
I fear no man, but that thing, it scares me.
Now, with her rudder jammed, the Bismarck was now moving in a large circle, unable to escape the oncoming British force, which included the battleships King George V, the Rodney, and heavy cruisers Dorsetshire and Norfolk. Following a few skirmishes, the King George V led an attack on the 27th of May, where it and Rodney began the engagement from far off. Closing in as the battle continued, with the Norfolk and Dorsetshire beginning to fire when within range. The Bismarck attempted to fire back, but to no real effect. Due to the Bismarck's thick armor on her hull, the British guns were having little effect there. They began to target the superstructure of the ship. And this is where we get to the biggest irony of the battle. Bismarck was such a huge and well-armored ship that this advantage ended up almost being a disadvantage to her in her last moments. Because she couldn't sink, her decks began to be shelled and her sailors dodged artillery fire as if they were infantry on land.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
One by one, Bismarck's gun turrets went silent, and enough damage was eventually done to the ship that it rolled over and later sank. And I know there's a whole debate over whether or not British guns or German scuttling took down the ship. I've heard convincing arguments for both, and I don't think there's anything I could really add to that conversation. I will say, though, that regardless of who dealt the actual killing, sinking blow, the ship had been combat ineffective for a while now, and the whole argument seems kind of pointless to me. Once sunk, some of the Bismarck's crew were picked up by the British ships, although before all were grabbed, it is thought that a U-boat was spotted far off, and the British ships had to withdraw, leaving a significant portion of the survivors in the water to drown. Now, I had not read much about the war in the Atlantic previous to making this video, but it is interesting to me that the same faults found in the land war are also very present in the war in the Atlantic. First is that you have a very cost-intensive, technology-advanced weapon that can only be made in small quantities, but is created in the hope that it can kill at a high ratio. Does that sound familiar? The Bismarck to me is the epitome of the Germans putting all their eggs in one basket, just like they do with, say, their mid to late war tank designs. And it's funny to me how pervasive the problem was. Second, the atrocious planning made for this ship on her maiden voyage. A lot of people criticize Linderman for his actions, particularly his message back to Berlin, and blame him for the issues the Bismarck had. But I don't think this is the case, though. This is another classic example of the German high command biting off more than they can chew, based on technological overconfidence. The original plan for the Bismarck's maiden voyage was meant to involve many more ships. However, these ships had been damaged previously and were still undergoing repairs when the operation was set to launch. But the Germans launched it anyway, placing all their faith in the Bismarck's ability to fight. You can even make the argument that the Bismarck itself wasn't ready for the fight, as the crew had been quickly rushed through its training, and that's pretty clearly exemplified in the second half of its combat performance. Given all of these things that the Bismarck had to deal with, it looks as if it was almost sent out to die, even if that was the last intention of the German high command. And I think what happened was, with Barbarossa coming up in the following month, the war in the Atlantic was the last thing on the German high command's mind. But it was still a big issue. So rather than divert time and planning to correctly roll out the Bismarck, they threw it out there in an attempt to solve the problem quickly, but with no real thought put into how. And this gave the British a prime opportunity to destroy the pride of Germany while its head was turned eastward. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. I've had a blast playing this game, and honestly I'll be continuing to play it in the future, but I really need to learn how to not suck. This game actually blew me away with how strategic and forward-thinking you need to be. It's quite the learning curve, but it's super fun at the same time. Don't forget that the game is completely free to download and play, and any new user gets tons of awesome in-game content, so definitely check the link to register and use the code in the box below. I would also like to thank my patrons on Patreon for helping this video be made, especially the ones at the $5 and $10 levels that you see on the screen. If you would like to support me on Patreon, there's a link for that as well down below, and we would love to have you on. Thank you for watching.
We found the mighty Bismarck and then we cut her down. We found the German battleship was making such a fuss. We had to sink the Bismarck cause the world depends on us. We hit the decks to run and we spun those guns around. We bombed the mighty Bismarck and then we cut her down.